Welcome to the fourth webinar conducted by the Center for Israel Education on the Hamas-Israel war. Today, we are going to dwell on Iran, Hamas, and the Israel domestic scene. Our work at the Center is dedicated to providing trustworthy and accurate information on the history, politics, and international relations of Israel. We engage teens, young adults, the general public, and the media, and just curious learners. Come visit our website. Please join us for some reliable information on Israel and the Hamas-Israel war. Looking back to October 6th, there was no active conflict between Israel and Hamas on the Gaza Strip-Israel border. And then on Saturday morning, October 7th, the tranquility was interrupted by a couple thousand Hamas terrorists who infiltrated the border and killed over 1,400 Israelis and others, kidnapped 239, and Israel was stunned, as was the international community. In reading the Arabic press, however limited that's been for me, I can say that there are distinctions that are being made between some of the countries that are sitting in the Gulf, like Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia has been remarkably circumspect. Other countries have embraced Hamas quite fully. Meir Litvak will start us off today. Meir is a specialist on Iran at Tel Aviv University. Following Meir, we'll turn to Jonathan Schanzer and then to Doron Shultziner as we take a look at what goes on inside the state of Israel. The weaponization of the event on October 7th, was that apparent in Hamas ideology or philosophy as it evolved from its origins 35 years ago? Was this something new?
The success is new. The ideas are not new. Hamas ideology from its origins has been very violent, very volatile. Hamas advocated all-out jihad against Israel. Hamas advocated vicious anti-Semitism, borrowing anti-Semitic themes from Islamic tradition and borrowing anti-Semitic themes from modern Western tradition, such as the Protocols of the Zion, the blood libel, and other vicious anti-Semitic tropes. And most importantly, Hamas advocated in its charter, in many other publications, the extermination of the Jewish people. Not only the extermination of Israel as a Jewish state, a precondition, prerequisite for the end of time is the elimination of the Jewish people. So these themes can be found in the Charter of 1988, and they can be found in sermons by Hamas leaders carried on Hamas TV as late as several months ago.
You would call this genocidal outlook?
Absolutely. When you say that eventually all of the Jews will be killed, this is genocide. There's a debate on Israel whether you can call this war existential in the sense that Hamas does not threaten the existence of Israel. Israel is too strong. But should we lose to Hamas eventually or to Islamists? Yes, then physical survival will be at stake. Yes, it will be in danger. It's a question of life and death in the sense that we must repulse this radical Islamist organizations and ideology.
Jonathan, in your research, were you keen to the genocidal nature of Hamas's intentions?
Oh, it's been clear from the very early days of Hamas's founding in 1988. There was an attempt a few years ago in Qatar to provide some kind of an addendum. It was actually not a revision of the charter, but an additional document that attempted to frame Hamas in something of a more moderate light. This was, of course, the doing of the Qataris, who are still very much involved in the funding and support of Hamas. That's where Hamas actually maintains one of its two major external headquarters. But yeah, the goal has remained the same. One of the things that it really strikes me every time, and I've covered now 5 of these rounds of conflict before this one between Israel and Hamas, I think we've become somewhat numb to the rocket attacks out of Gaza. You have to understand something. They have fired thousands and thousands of rockets into Israel. They are not guided rockets. They're not aiming them at anything in particular. They are firing them in the hope that they land on something. And that something could be a school, a hospital, an apartment building. They don't care what it is. And by the way, that is a war crime. Not aiming your weapon before you shoot it with the hope of hitting civilian infrastructure is a war crime. The intent of all of this has been to kill as many Israelis as possible. That is, in essence, genocidal as well. It's actually really interesting. People talk about Iron Dome as this wonderful gift that Israel has given itself that has saved thousands and thousands of Israeli lives and millions upon millions of dollars in damage to property. But Iron Dome has, I think, numbed the world to the genocidal intentions of Hamas, because Israel has been safer as a result of it, because it has not had to deal with many impacts by Hamas rockets. We've sort of shrugged and said, okay, well, they're weaker and they can't quite do what they want, so what's the big deal? Well, I think 10/7 shattered that paradigm. 10/7, I think, woke everybody up to the fact that if they could, they would kill more and more people. And this is, I think, the essence of Hamas that needs to be understood.
Meir, how do you judge the connection between Hamas in Gaza and the Iranian government? We know that Hamas leaders have articulated very blatantly their thanks and support for what Iran has provided in terms of logistics and finances, etc. In some people's mind, it's difficult for them to understand if Hamas is an independent actor or semi-independent actor or an insurgency or a client. How would you characterize that relationship?
Hamas is an independent organization. Hamas and Iran are allies. Hamas is not an Iranian satellite, unlike the Islamic Jihad, which is very much an Iranian satellite, or Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hamas is thankful to any government or movement that supports its struggle against Israel, and they are very happy to receive any kind of support. But in the past, they warned Iran that they're not going to support Iran, let's say, in its conflict with the Emirates on the 3 islands in the Persian Gulf. During the so-called Arab Spring, when the Syrian government, aided by Iran, massacred its own Sunni population, Hamas was very unhappy about it, even criticized Iran. This was a period of, let's say, cool relations between the two parties. But later, in a way, they reconciled. Hamas does not receive orders from Iran. It receives support, and Iran is proud to say that they help anyone who fights Israel. Whether they are Sunnis or Shias or any other, they are generous to everyone who fights Israel, as long as Iran does not have to fight it for itself. Iran needs proxies to do its job for it, and Iran uses Arabs to fight Israel or to fight other enemies. I always like to quote a Saudi journalist who said that Iran is willing to fight until the last drop of the last Arab.
So, Jonathan, the alliance which Hamas has with Iran is an alliance of convenience, and it overlaps as an alliance of conviction because they both have deep-seated hatred for the state of Israel. Is that fair?
It's fair. I'd want to dig a little bit deeper there. You have to go back to the beginning of Hamas. In the early 1990s, we witnessed a significant investment on the part of the regime in Iran to train Hamas in places like Sudan. And by the way, most people are not aware of this early history, but Iran was training Hamas in Sudan alongside organizations like Al-Qaeda. There was a sort of what they called an Islamist international, a collaboration of sorts. It was a grouping of entities and actors, state and non-state, that had a clear, maybe several clear goals in mind: attacking America, attacking Israel, destroying the West. This was the cornerstone. Now, the relationship has waxed and waned over the years. There have been moments where Hamas and Iran are fully aligned, and then there have been moments where they're not aligned. A recent moment where they haven't been aligned was during the Syrian civil war, when Iran was helping the Assad regime kill Sunnis as well as Palestinians that were opposed to Assad's rule. And so we saw several years where they kind of took a break from each other. But right now, we are looking at a full alignment in terms of goals, but also in terms of tactics and strategies. There is something that is called the Nerve Center. It is coordinated by the Iranians in Lebanon right now. It includes Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other groups, their goal is to closely coordinate their violent activities. This is not just a marriage of convenience. There's clear conviction here, and there is a clear effort to coordinate activities so that they can be deadlier. If anything, right now we're watching a peak of sorts in the relationship between Hamas and Iran and the broader axis, as they call themselves, the various groups that align themselves with Iran. In my view, that's what makes this a particularly dangerous moment, because we are now seeing not only hostilities between Hamas and Israel, but rather we are seeing Shiite militias aligned with Iran in places like Syria and Iraq that are now activated. You've got Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is activated. You've got the Houthis in Yemen, and they are activated. All of these groups are fighting in concert with Iran in order to potentially overwhelm Israel. Now, right now, this regional war is at the low-level asymmetric one. One can potentially see, if we're not careful, an escalation where more of these fronts grow hotter. And that is the real concern. And that all comes down to this very close alignment between Iran and its proxies, with Hamas being at the top of that list.
Doron, we're going to ask you to do something a little bit different. You've watched Israeli civil society for a long time. You've watched social media. One of the less reported elements of this unfolding in Israel is how Israelis themselves have reacted to this national trauma or shock. How do you see Israeli civil society reacting?
I think what we see here, have seen here, is a little bit of a repeat of what we've seen in the 2006 Second Lebanon War, which is very similar in the sense that civil society went straight into this vacuum that the government has left in catering for its citizens. Back then it was in the north, where citizens were under attack mostly by rockets, missiles fired from Hezbollah, and escaping to the south. Now it's the other way around, where the rockets and the atrocities committed in the south, and these citizens fleeing to the north and also to the south to Eilat. So civil society, in both cases, and especially now as we see, was very quick to fill in this vacuum. The vacuum consisted of both the fact that the military and the whole state apparatus obviously was caught off guard. So first thing, they needed to give immediate response to the military threat and to push it back to Gaza. The entire apparatus handling citizens was completely absent, or almost completely absent, for several days. And it was highly criticized in the Israeli media. Where is the government? Where are all these ministers that have been on TikTok and have been voice for us over the last year, and suddenly they all disappear? Where is the state power to give immediate relief to these people? So Israeli society, from the immediate moments, from going to the battlefield and rescuing citizens on personal initiatives, through taking the families to safe houses all around Israel, to economic initiatives or private initiatives of housing these people in hotels and in other places where expenses needed to be put in, obviously to catering for clothes, for cell phones, for laptops, anything that you can think of, really. Anything from showers. There is a guy going to military bases and made this mobile shower for soldiers to have a shower in the field, to cooking meals all over Israel, not only for soldiers, but for those families. Really, all the basic and non-basic essentials that you can think of, Israeli society was mobilized in the most amazing way, something that people really take pride of. And also many people feel that they need to do something other than being in the military. There's this urge of doing, of helping, of volunteering, of donating money, and all these famous ceramic vests. Some of them also came from the US and from Israel. So a whole scale mobilization of Israeli society in the most amazing way that I can remember.
Speak for a moment about not only Israeli Jews, but we know that Arab Bedouin in the south were butchered as well. Israeli Arabs constitute 20% of the Israeli population. I know it's difficult to generalize for a population of maybe 1.5 or 2 million people. But what sticks out? What do you sense has been a response from that element of Israeli society?
It's a good question, and one that many Israelis also thought about, worried about. There were also discussions about this in the media. So let's remember, first of all, that Israeli Arabs were also casualties, as you mentioned, not just Bedouins. Even an Arab Israeli from eastern Jerusalem who was massacred. And in fact, when they came up to him, they asked him, "Are you an Arab?" And he said, "I'm an Arab," and still they shot him. They shot Arab women with head covers. It was clear that they were non-Jews, that they were Arab, that they were Muslim, and nevertheless they were shot. About 40 Israeli Arabs were massacred in this way. That's one thing. Second thing, we have to remember that Arab Israelis were also part of this huge effort to save people, doing dramatic, heroic efforts. For example, for an Arab Israeli to take his bus under fire, go in without any protection, and to save people. And also Arab Israelis that were there in this horrible party in Re'im also saved many party goers. Going to the larger circle, Arab Israelis are also targets of these rockets. A rocket fell on Abu Ghosh, not far from Jerusalem, injuring an Arab Israeli, falling near a house next to a student of mine. So Arab Israelis go to the shelters and they experience all these horrible, horrible things, especially the Arab Bedouins in the south that have zero protection, none at all, and they are experiencing these rockets and artillery. Beyond that, I think that we saw also mobilization of a significant part of Israeli Arabs in those efforts that I mentioned, in cooking and making food for soldiers, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds and thousands of volunteers. For example, today I saw one that is the people who die and you need to identify them in the morgue, and is going over those mutilated bodies and saying he volunteers to do so. He says not a single one of them was intact. And many, many expressing sympathy, expressing solidarity, saying we're all citizens of the same country. So I would like to highlight this aspect. Obviously, within the Arab population, which is very diverse, you can also find a few people that have written in Facebook and social media things that they were actually arrested for. But I think this is the exception that proves the rule. We saw zero violence. If there was any violence, it was directed, unfortunately, toward Israeli Arabs. No violence by Israeli Arabs toward Jews. The chief of police also said in the Knesset that the behavior of Israeli Arabs was remarkable, remarkable. And we have to remember that the identity issues here are not simple at all, being both, for many of them, both Palestinian on the one hand and Israeli on the other hand, being attacked on several fronts. So on the whole, I think this has been a remarkable test and a remarkable outcome so far, and I'm sure that this will be lasting for Israeli Arabs in this conflict.
I want to add one point to what Doron said, which I fully agree with. If you look at Israeli hospitals, over 30% of the doctors in Israeli hospitals are Arabs, not to mention the number of nurses. By the way, above their share in the population. The Israeli medical system would not have survived without the Arab participation. And we are talking about the Arab doctors taking care of people who were injured by this massacre on October 7th and are taking care of Israeli soldiers, wounded Israeli soldiers. So I fully agree with what Doron said. I think this is also a point which is important when we look at the bigger picture.
The dynamics within the Palestinian Arab national movement after 1993, after Oslo, after Arafat recognized the state of Israel, and after the process unfolded of turning some territory and some administration over to the PLO, 2 elections, Hamas continues to show its opposition to anything that recognizes the state of Israel, any organization or any element within the PLO that does so. How does Hamas grow its support in the Gaza Strip before it overthrows the Palestinian Authority in a coup d'etat in 2007? And after 2007, how does that continue?
The keys to Hamas's success, if you will, first lie in the PLO's failure, the Palestinian Authority's failure. The corruption in particular has been a source of constant agitation for the Palestinian population. I mean, when you look back at what the international community devoted to the Palestinian cause during the 1990s, during the heyday of the Oslo process, we're talking about huge amounts of money that was ultimately squandered by Yasser Arafat. Then there was a moment where it looked like Mahmoud Abbas would come in and right the ship. And unfortunately, what we've seen from him is more of the same: complete and total corruption and a lack of accountability. The guy is now 18 years into a 4-year term. The guy came in 2005, has refused to hold elections since. And what we're seeing is a guy that is an immovable object. That's part of the popularity. It's just been the unpopularity of the PLO leadership, the Palestinian Authority leadership. But on top of that, I think it's also important to note here that Hamas has built up a following because it has this powerful cocktail of Palestinian nationalism married with Islamism, and yes, some violence. The suicide bombings, the attacks that it's carried out over the years, they seem to be unwavering, unbending, fully committed to the cause. And they speak to the Palestinian population in various languages that they want to be spoken to. I'm not talking about Arabic. I'm talking about fierce nationalism, fierce Islamism, that this is the thing that has appealed to various sectors of Palestinian society. So that's played an important role. And then the last thing is that in Gaza in particular, but also to some extent in the West Bank, it's the services that have been provided, the kindergartens, the schools, the sports centers, a whole range of things. It's really interesting now because not long before this webinar began, the Israelis were releasing information where Hamas leaders were openly talking about diverting fuel from a hospital. In other words, truly exploiting the population. It's unclear how much of that hurts the organization, even as it's being released, even as they're being exposed, because they have built up this reputation of having provided all these services to the people. And it's as if that reputation can't be eroded by some of the things that the Israelis are beginning to expose.
So Hamas has been very much an autocratic organization in the Gaza Strip that also appeals to the population's daily needs, and it suffuses together, as you called it, a cocktail. And there are other elements as well, but basically that's it.
I want to add a few points. I agree with what Jonathan said. Fatah had a problem because Fatah was a nationalist movement without any social agenda.
Before you go further, would you define Fatah for the audience?
Fatah was the main Palestinian movement that struggled against Israel. It was established in 1965, whose main goal was to liberate Palestine, namely, in the beginning, eliminate Israel. It took over the PLO, became the main movement within the PLO, which was the Roof Organization, and it was headed by Yasser Arafat until his death in 2004. Fatah focused on what they called national liberation. They lacked, by intention, any social agenda, which meant that the moment they signed the Oslo Accords and gave up the idea of fully liberating Palestine, they lost lots. That was one major problem. Another major problem is corruption. Third problem, especially in Gaza, when Fatah ruled Gaza from 1994 until 2007, there was internal chaos in Gaza, lawlessness, gang warfare. People in Gaza were sick and tired of Fatah. To Hamas' credit, they restored law and order in Gaza in the early years. That gave them lots of credit among the people in Gaza, and we can't take it away from them. In addition, whereas Fatah was totally corrupt, initially Hamas leadership lived modest life. They lived in the refugee camps, they lived modest life, and that was served as another model. There's also another point, and I'm saying it with some pain. We also made some mistakes as Israelis. There were groups within the Israeli government, including Netanyahu, who believe that we can somehow handle Hamas, but the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, is more dangerous because Fatah pretends to be pro-peace, but in fact they undermine Israel. And with Hamas, it's simple. It's black and white picture. We know how to deal with Hamas. PLO, Palestinian Authority, is a more complicated issue, and they are more dangerous in this regard. And since we can't, or we don't want to reach any deal with them, maintaining the status quo is better for Israel. And therefore, there were groups in Israel, again, within Israel. So the Israeli government said, no, we can manage with Hamas. We can control the tiger, which was our mistake. Now, I fully agree, by the way, that as a government, the Palestinian Authority is a complete failure. What the Palestinians lacked was their own Ben Gurion, the people who could be a state leader, state builder. By the way, there was one such person, Salam Fayyad, who understood the need that if you want to achieve independence, you need to build institutions, you need to build Palestinian society. Tragically for the Palestinians, he got 3% of the vote in the 2006 elections. So the Palestinians preferred leaders who were great demagogues who spoke about national liberation, but not state builders. So they had this problem of failure in state building, but we also made some mistakes. I think we could have been more helpful to the Palestinian Authority. They're not ideal, they're not our friends, but they're the lesser evil. We could have helped them against Hamas, and I think we made mistakes here. I'm saying it with great sorrow.
You both spoke about the corruption of the PLO and the Fatah and of Arafat and of Abbas. And one of the reasons that Hamas is successful in the elections that take place, the second Palestinian elections, is probably because the PLO and Fatah were so weak and so disjointed that they were able to field candidates that could look like they won in the democratic election. And that's probably why many people in the international community embraced Hamas as a legitimate organization for Palestinian aspirations. The lesson to be learned here, just because you have elections doesn't necessarily mean that expresses the full will of the population. It may just be the way the elections unfolded, that was the outcome. I don't want to dwell on it, but what always seems to happen is we seem to see an event in the West anyway. We see the results of the event and we don't understand the underpinnings or the political culture that gurgle beneath the surface that caused the event to unfold the way it was. I mean, why else would a Secretary of State say to Hamas, sure, you can participate in those elections? And that happened. Condoleezza Rice happened. That was a process, and that legitimized Hamas in the eyes of many, many people. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because I know we could spend a lot of time on it. I wanted to toss back to Doron for a moment. You do understand the social media platforms in Israel. Before October 6th, if you can think back to it, and since, how have you been able to understand how the social media expressions have demonstrated public opinion?
Social media, or at least the ones that I'm exposed to, pretty much reflect the general atmosphere of shock, of sorrow, of remembering those who have died, murdered, the stories, so many stories that you hear and you learn about. So in that respect, it echoes what you also see on mainstream media. Secondly, and perhaps obviously or not obvious, is a complete shift between the parlance that we have had until October 7th, the one that is characterized by political polarization, right versus left, an agenda based on the judicial overall and democratic backsliding, again, based on right and left opinions. And all that has almost, not entirely, but almost completely disappeared. Less fighting, very little fighting, in fact, between right and left on social media and also in mainstream media. People wanting to come together, be together, one people, together we are strong. That's the slogan that almost everyone has embraced. So in that respect, social media echoes all these elements in larger, broader society. And the other interesting aspect here about social media is actually coming from Facebook, that has targeted Israel specifically by limiting the people who can comment on posts and made the default only to your friends, as opposed to previously where if your default was public, then everyone could see and everyone can comment. And they did so because unfortunately, Hamas at the beginning really did, aside from these atrocities, committed online atrocities by hacking into social media accounts, going into people's accounts, posting pictures in the Facebook pages of people who were murdered with their pictures, really horrendous things. Also people from outside the region commenting and posting nasty things. Part of it's disinformation, part of it's propaganda. So Facebook relatively quickly changed the default to prevent all these people from posting all those comments. So that's another characteristic that you see. If you enter Facebook in Israel, you see only certain people can comment on these posts. And sometimes you're, for example, blocked from commenting, even if it's someone that you follow, but you're not friends with.
We're right in the middle of something, or maybe not in the middle, maybe if it's a four-quarter soccer match, we may only be in the first couple minutes of the first quarter. We don't know the duration of this. We don't know its magnitude. We don't know its depth. Is it too early to estimate what lessons might be learned from how this began and what consciousness that we need to pay attention to as it does unfold? And I'm not talking about a commission of inquiry that's going to point fingers and take a look at failings and assumptions and mindsets and all of that. What lessons are there to be learned about Israel in the Middle East? What do we know today, or what should we have known on October 6th that we know now?
The prevailing assumption in the Israeli military and intelligence establishment on October 6th was that Hamas was no longer eager to invite disastrous wars upon Gaza, and that Hamas was more interested in providing for the population that it controlled, that it was pivoting toward governance. I think a key lesson learned here is that that is not something that any of Iran's proxies will be willing to do. They exist for one primary reason, and that is to wage war against Israel and to try to overturn the US-led order in the Middle East. The very idea that Israeli intelligence would even countenance that, I think it was not a good sign, and I do think that at some point heads will roll. Forgetting just about who loses their job and who keeps it, the idea here has to be that Israel learns, and quite frankly, that America learns, that there is no moderating these actors. And so Israel made a huge mistake as it relates to Hamas, but let's just broaden this out for a minute. I believe that successive administrations have failed tremendously as it relates to Iran itself, that Iran could be perhaps persuaded to become more moderate, or that we could appeal to the moderates within Iran, or that we could give them sanctions relief as it relates to the Iranian nuclear program, but believe in our hearts somehow that that sanctions relief wouldn't ultimately end up helping the regime and financing some of the malign actors that we're watching today wage war against Israel. The entire concept needs to be revisited. These are determined actors that have one goal in mind, primarily, and that is the destruction of Israel. And then from there, they might have bigger goals, right? When we hear about the regime in Iran, they talk about death to America and death to Israel. When you see the Houthis firing rockets at Israel, their motto is death to America, death to Israel, death to the Jews. I think it's time that the world stops trying to pretend that we could see moderation out of any of these actors and to treat them as hostiles that are a danger to the American-led order. I think we're seeing a little bit of a wake-up call now, but I've not seen, certainly in the United States, we've not seen an acknowledgement of the collapse of that paradigm that led us to this place. We see it in Israel to a certain extent, and people are coming out and apologizing. Some people aren't, some people are. But I think there needs to be a complete shakeup in the way that these actors are addressed moving forward.
We have to take seriously what these movements say and write in their own languages. There was a tendency among scholars in the West, including some in Israel, to dismiss ideological writings, to dismiss statements by leaders of these movements. Oh, this is only rhetoric. Oh, it's only for domestic consumption. They don't really mean it because no serious person would believe in this nonsense. This is wrong. We are talking about people who genuinely believe in what they say, and we have to take it seriously. And I would say, especially, you have to take seriously anyone who says that he hates you and wants to kill you. They say they love you, okay. But if someone tells that he hates you and wants to kill you, take it seriously. And we had this tendency to dismiss it, as if it was not really serious. Maybe one mistake is that most of the scholars, including myself, we are secular people. Maybe we don't understand sufficiently how radical religious people think, that their rationality may be different from ours, that their priorities may be different from ours. And I think this is something that we have to remember, that, again, radical religious people think differently. They're not like us. They have different values, thoughts, and priorities.
Taking political fundamentalism more seriously is definitely the lesson here. I think many people were partly naive and partly applying different frames of what we now call the conception or the paradigm about the ability to co-opt and to control via carrots mostly, with a little bit of sticks, those fundamentalist organizations. We were sure that Hamas was deterred. Netanyahu said so himself. This was his primary strategy. No one realized that Hamas would ever, including the military echelon, that Hamas was not deterred, that they will dare to go into this cycle of war. Same thing for Hezbollah, which is, I think, the most interesting question that we're now facing, because Hezbollah is probably 10 times stronger than Hamas. Had they initiated this in the north rather than the south, the amount of casualties would be enormous. Enormous. I don't even want to think about what would have happened had we seen an invasion of several thousands, maybe 10,000 commando soldiers from Hezbollah into Israel. And that's something that wasn't in the conception, in the paradigm, the military paradigm that we have had. And that will certainly change. One change that we already see is letting people get guns, of course, with permits. Also, there are semi-automatic rifles in certain sensitive towns in Israel, because the understanding now is that the first response would probably be from civilians. So civilians need to be armed. You can imagine what would have happened had at least half the families around Gaza had guns in their homes. I'm sure that the casualties will be far less. There were very brave stories of people that managed to protect themselves with a private gun. So I think that's also one of the lessons. And there have been more than 100,000 permit requests for private guns. One of them is from me. And I would never think of having a gun. But the loss of sense of security among Israelis is so high, but also the need for this has become so visible that I think this is something we will see. Obviously, it also could have negative implications, but for the short term, I think it's a must.
Let me try and tie it up with a really tough question. with short answers. Part of the mindset or part of the belief system has been that these two nationalisms could separate from one another and could exist alongside one another. And of course, we've heard for many years the two-state solution. A couple of questions have popped up into the chat. Does that mean we have to forget about the two-state solution? Does that mean it's no longer viable? The whole idea of trust between two sides who could negotiate with one another has practically disappeared. But the question is, what are we looking for when Israel decides that this is over?
It's a great question to ask because it's the way forward. True peace is usually won by way of a victory on the battlefield and imposing your will on the enemy if you win. In other words, that's how borders are determined. That's how peace agreements are struck. I think the greatest challenge associated with Oslo was that the Palestinians were not necessarily negotiating from a position of defeat. And I do believe that right now you will see something along those lines if the US and Israeli plan holds, that there is a successful effort to keep Iran and Hezbollah out of a regional battle, and there will be a complete defeat of Hamas. This is the plan. If they are able to execute on that over the course of, let's say, the next several weeks, there will be a different reality in the Middle East where Iran will have lost a valuable chess piece on the board. It will have been forced to watch helplessly if all goes well, and Israel will be in a position where it can make demands. Now, there will still be outrage across the Arab world, and we're seeing it articulated by the Iranians and the Turks and by the Jordanians and the Egyptians, and everybody's going crazy. But the thing is, in this part of the world, strength still means a great deal. And being able to impose a defeat on your enemy and to be able to determine the new terms will be crucial. And I think Israel could, if they play their cards right, if the U.S. deterrence holds, this could be an outcome that could paradoxically lead to a new understanding with the Palestinians.
And Secretary of State Blinken has said he's coming to the Middle East. And before he's going, he's already said, we hope that the Palestinian Authority can assert itself and play a role in Gaza tomorrow. At least that's what he said yesterday. Who knows what will be said tomorrow or Friday when he gets to Israel.
I have a little different view. I think two-state solution is not an ideal solution, but it is better than any other alternative. Because the alternative to two-state solution is a one-state solution, which will mean an Arab state with an Arab majority, which will mean the end of Zionism, the end of the Jewish dream. One state of Israel and Israelis and Palestinians will be hell. It will be Lebanon and Syria together. You can't bring two rival peoples in one state and hope that there will be any kind of coexistence. It will be Lebanon at best, Syria at its worst. Two states do not mean necessarily peace, okay? The dream that we can have two-state solution that will somehow will live with a Palestinian state, like we always used to say, Belgium and Holland, the relationship, that's a pipe dream, that's a dream. But we can think of, because again, the alternative is much worse, of two states that coexist with each other with tenuous, problematic relations. Neither side likes the other. Both sides will have dreams about the future that will remain unfulfilled because the alternative is worse. And politics is the art of the possible, not the art of the desirable. And we have no alternative because, again, the alternative is one state or South Africa. And Israel will not survive as South Africa. That's a dream. That's, again, another dream. So, again, it's a bad solution, but the others are much worse.
Gentlemen, thank you so very much for your time, your expertise, and your insights.